The first time I noticed him, he was already looking back at me, not glancing over, not passing by, just standing there, perfectly still, on the opposite sidewalk with his hands at his sides, staring directly at my front door. And the thing that got me, the thing that made my stomach drop before my brain could even process what I was seeing, was that he didn't react at all when I appeared in the window. No embarrassed look away, no wave, no pretending he'd been checking his phone. He just kept staring, as if he'd been expecting me to show up exactly when I did. I'm not someone who spooks easily. I want to be upfront about that, because I know how these stories can sound. I've lived alone for 6 years. I've dealt with difficult situations. I don't call the police over weird feelings. But what happened over the next 3 weeks made me question every assumption I had about the house I lived in, the neighbors I thought I knew, and whether any of us are ever as safe as we believe we are. You need to hear this, because I don't think what happened to me is over, and I don't think I was the first. I moved into the house on Carver Street in late September. It was a rental, a narrow 2-story with original hardwood floors and a bay window that looked out over a quiet, tree-lined block, the kind of street where people still put out bird feeders and swept their own sidewalks. My realtor called it established. What she meant was that most of the residents had lived there for 20 or 30 years, and everyone knew everyone. Everyone except me. The first few weeks were normal. I unpacked. I introduced myself to the neighbor on my left, a retired teacher named Dolores, who immediately brought over banana bread and told me to call her if I ever needed anything. The house to my right sat empty, a foreclosure, she said, that had been on the market for 2 years. Across the street were 3 houses, a family with a screaming toddler I only ever saw in passing, an older couple who gardened obsessively on weekends, and a pale blue house with white trim that appeared to belong to no one at all. No lights in the windows, no car in the driveway, no mail visible in the box. Just a pale blue house that sat and watched the street the same way the street watched it. That was the house he was standing in front of. It was a Tuesday evening in mid-October. I remember because I had just gotten off a draining work call, and I'd walked to the bay window with a glass of water, intending to stare outside for a few minutes and decompress. The sun was already low, that particular autumn gold that makes everything look slightly cinematic, and the street was empty, except for him. He was on the sidewalk directly across from my house, maybe 40 feet away. A man. Average height, average build, wearing dark pants and a jacket that was too heavy for the weather we'd been having. His hands were at his sides. He wasn't on a phone. He wasn't holding anything. He wasn't walking a dog or waiting for someone or doing anything that people normally do when they're standing on a sidewalk. He was just standing there. Looking at my door, I stepped back from the window instinctively, that thing your body does before your mind decides whether to be afraid. Then I told myself I was being paranoid and moved back to look again. He hadn't moved, but now he was looking at the window, at me. For a long moment I stood there, water glass in hand, the two of us just staring at each other across 40 feet of autumn evening. Then my phone rang, a text from a friend, and I looked down for maybe 3 seconds. When I looked back up, he was gone. I checked both directions down the street. The sidewalks were empty. I hadn't heard footsteps. I hadn't heard a door open or a car start. He had simply been there, and then he wasn't. I told myself it was a neighbor I hadn't met. I told myself there was a completely reasonable explanation. I closed the tusked curtains on the bay window for the first time since I'd moved in. I slept with the hall light on that night, which I hadn't done since I was 9 years old. The second time was 3 days later. Same spot, same stillness. But it was later, almost 10 o'clock at night, and the street was dark except for the amber pool of the nearest lamppost, which fell about 15 feet short of where he was standing. He was in shadow. I might not have seen him at all, except that I was taking the recycling out and the motion sensor on my porch light clicked on and sent a wedge of yellow light out across the street, and he was just there, at the edge of it. I froze on my own porch. He didn't move. I have tried many times to describe the feeling of that moment, and the best I can do is this. It wasn't fear, exactly. Fear is hot. This was cold. This was the feeling of suddenly understanding that something had been happening without your knowledge, and that whatever it was, it had been going on longer than you'd realized. I went back inside. I locked the door. I went to the window and watched him through a gap in the curtains. He stood there for another hour and 40 minutes. I know because I kept checking the clock, telling myself each time that he'd be gone by now, and each time I looked, he wasn't. Sometime after 11:30, I fell asleep on the couch without meaning to. When I woke up at 2 in the morning, the street was empty and the curtains were still pulled together, and I had the irrational but overwhelming sense that he had watched me fall asleep. The next morning, I knocked on Dolores's door. Dolores was one of those people who made you feel immediately at ease, which was why what happened when I described the man made her reaction land so hard. She listened without interrupting, unusual for her, and when I finished she was quiet for a moment in a way that felt less like she was thinking and more like she was deciding something. "What did he look like?" she asked finally. I described him. Medium height, dark jacket, standing very still. She nodded slowly, set down her coffee cup, and then she said something that I've turned over in my mind probably 1,000 times since. "The Harmon house has been empty for 2 years, she said. "But before that, before the family that lived there moved out, they used to tell people someone stood out front at night." I stared at her. "The same man?" "I don't know," she said. "I never saw him myself. I thought they were." She trailed off. "They had a lot going on. I thought maybe they were exaggerating." "But they moved out," I said. Dolores picked up her coffee cup again. "They moved out in a hurry," she said carefully. "Didn't even list the house properly. Just left." I asked her which house was the Harmon house. She pointed, without hesitation, to the pale blue house with the white trim. I want to be precise about what I did next because I've had people tell me it was stupid, and maybe they're right, but I also don't think I had a complete picture of what I was dealing with yet. I looked up the blue house. Public records are easier to access than most people realize. The property had changed hands 14 months ago, purchased by an LLC with a name that meant nothing to me, 3 initials in the word holdings, and before that it had been owned by the Harmon family for 11 years. There was no listed resident. The utility accounts I found through a different search were paid automatically. The house was maintained, minimally but maintained. Someone cut the grass twice a summer. Someone had re-caulked the front windows at some point in the last few years. Someone paid attention to that house. They just didn't live in it. I found one other thing. In a local neighborhood forum archive from about 3 years ago, a thread that had been locked by a moderator after 17 replies. The original post was from a user named HarmonNeighbor98, and it said, "Has anyone else on Carver seen the man who stands outside at night? He's been across the street from us for weeks. We've called the police twice, and they say there's nothing they can do. He's not on our property. He's not doing anything illegal. But he's always looking at our house. We don't know what he wants. We don't know who he is. We just want it to stop." The thread was locked 3 months later. The replies ranged from concerned neighbors offering suggestions to 1 or 2 people insisting the family was overreacting. The last reply before locking was from a different user, someone I couldn't identify, whose only comment was, "They should have stayed inside after dark." I printed that thread out. I don't know why. It felt important to have something physical, something I could hold. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. That weekend, I decided I was going to look at the blue house more carefully. Not go inside, not trespass. Just walk past it in daylight, the way anyone might, and actually look at it the way I'd been avoiding doing since I moved in. Because I realized that I had been treating that house the way you treat a spider on the wall, watching it from across the room, tracking it with your peripheral vision, but never actually looking directly at it. It was a Saturday morning, clear and cold. I put on my jacket and walked out my front door and crossed the street. The house was quiet. Up close, it was in slightly better condition than I'd expected. The paint was old but not peeling. The porch boards were solid. The curtains in every window were drawn. There was a mailbox at the end of the short front path. I glanced at it as I passed. It wasn't empty. There was a single envelope inside, no postage, no address. Just a standard white envelope with nothing written on the outside. I stopped walking. I looked up and down the street. The neighborhood was quiet. A dog barked somewhere 2 blocks over. I should have kept walking. I know that. I took the envelope. I waited until I was back inside my own house before I opened it. I sat at the kitchen table, the same place I'd read the forum thread, and I opened the envelope. There was a single photograph inside. It was a picture of my front door, not taken from across the street, not taken from a distance. It was taken from close up, maybe 6 or 8 feet away, at an angle that suggested someone standing just slightly off to the side of my front path. Close enough that you could read the tarnishing on the brass numbers beside my door, close enough that you could see the small gouge in the wood of the frame where the previous tenant had installed and then removed a second lock. I didn't have any outdoor cameras. I hadn't installed any security lights except the motion sensor, and that only covered the porch and the immediate front path. The photograph was printed on standard paper. It didn't have a date on it, but there was a shadow at the very bottom right corner of the image. The faint, elongated shadow of a person standing just out of frame, cast by the angle of the light. And from the length and direction of that shadow, from the position of the sun, it implied, I could tell what time of day it had been taken. Late afternoon, between 4 and 5 o'clock. I had moved into the house 6 weeks ago. In that entire time, I had come home between 4 and 5 in the afternoon almost every single day. I called the police that evening. The officer who came, a young guy, patient, professional, listened to everything I told him. He looked at the photograph. He looked at the forum thread I'd printed out. He asked me several careful questions and wrote things down in his notebook and did all the things you'd hope a police officer would do. And then he told me what the family on the forum had already been told. Standing on a public sidewalk isn't illegal. Watching someone's house from a distance isn't illegal. Leaving an envelope in a neighbor's mailbox, even a vacant property's mailbox, wasn't something he could build a case on. What about the photograph? I said. He paused. It's unsettling, he said. I'm not dismissing it, but a photograph of your front door isn't a threat. He looked at me carefully. Is there anything else? Anything you haven't told me? I thought about the shadow at the bottom corner of the image, the implied time of day, the precision of it. He knows my schedule, I said. The officer nodded slowly. Change it, he said. Vary your routines. Don't keep the same patterns. And get cameras, inside and out. He gave me a card with a non-emergency number and told me to call if anything escalated. He was kind about it. He clearly believed me. He just couldn't do anything. After he left, I sat in my kitchen and thought about the fact that someone had been paying close enough attention to me, to my comings and goings, my patterns, the small identifiable details of my front door, to put a photograph like that into an envelope and leave it where I might find it. Not in my mailbox. In the mailbox across the street, as if they knew I'd look. I ordered cameras that night, 4 of them, front, back, both sides. They arrived 2 days later, and I installed them myself, which took most of an afternoon. I also bought 2 new deadbolts and a door bar for the back entrance. I stopped going to bed before midnight and started checking the window before I turned the lights out. For a week, nothing happened. The sidewalk across the street stayed empty. I varied my schedule the way the officer told me to. Different departure times, different routes home, parking down the block some evenings instead of in my driveway. I felt slightly ridiculous doing it, like I was performing caution rather than actually being cautious. But the alternative was doing nothing, and I'd already decided I was done with that. Then, on a Wednesday night, my front camera sent an alert to my phone at 2:17 in the morning. I was in bed. I grabbed the phone without sitting up, opened the app, tapped into the live view. The street was empty. I watched for 30 seconds, a minute. Nothing moved. No cars, no animals, no people. The sidewalk across from my house, the spot where he always stood, was bare. The pale blue house behind it sat dark and closed. I was about to put the phone down when I switched to the side camera, the one covering the narrow strip of yard between my house and the empty foreclosure next door. He was there, not across the street, not on the sidewalk. He was standing in the side yard, maybe 15 feet from my house, in the shadows between the two buildings. He was looking up. He was looking up at my bedroom window. I did not move. I lay in my bed in the dark, and I watched him on the screen of my phone, and I made myself breathe slowly and not make any sound. The camera had night vision, grainy, greenish, but clear enough. He was close enough now that I could see more details. Dark jacket, same as before. He was maybe in his 50s. Ordinary face. The kind of face you wouldn't remember if you passed it on the street. He wasn't moving. My hand was shaking. I called 911. They said they'd send a car. They said it would be a few minutes. I watched him on the screen for those few minutes. He didn't move. He didn't look at the camera, which was mounted at the roof line. I don't think he knew it was there. He just stood in the shadows and looked up at my window. I heard the police car before I saw it, the quiet murmur of an engine slowing at the end of the block. And then something happened that I keep trying to make sense of. Before the police car turned onto Carver Street, before it was visible from where he was standing, he left. Not quickly, not like someone startled by approaching sirens. He turned, slowly and calmly, and walked back through the gap between the houses, toward the street. And by the time the patrol car's headlights swept across my side yard, he was gone. 2 officers came to the door. They searched the side yard with flashlights, checked around the perimeter of the house. They found nothing except a single footprint in the strip of bare soil along the foundation. They photographed it. They were kind and thorough, and just as unable to do anything as the first officer had been. He was tipped off by the sound of our car, one of them said. But I didn't hear anything, I said. How did he hear you that far away? Neither of them had an answer for that. I called Dolores in the morning. I told her what had happened. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. You should stay with someone, she said, until this is sorted out. Dolores, I said, do you know anything else? About the family that lived in the blue house before it went vacant? Anything you didn't tell me? Another silence, a different kind this time. The Harmons, she said finally. They had a daughter, teenage girl. She was the one who saw him first, they told me. She was the one who was most frightened. She paused. When they left, she had been through a hard time. The mother told me she wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating, that it had really affected her. What was the girl's name? Maya, Dolores said. Do you know where they went? No, she said. I got a card at Christmas that first year. Return address was a P.O. box. She hesitated. There was a note in the card, just one line. She wrote, "He found us." I thought it was a joke, some dark humor about the move. Her voice was quieter now. I didn't know what to do with it, so I didn't do anything. I've thought about it many times since. I thanked her and hung up the phone. He found us. I sat with that for a long time. Here is what I know and what I don't know, and I want to be careful to separate them. What I know. A man stood across the street from my house, multiple times across several weeks. He stood in my side yard at 2 a.m. and looked up at my bedroom window. He left a photograph of my front door in the mailbox of a vacant house. He knew when I arrived home. He knew to leave before the police arrived. What I don't know, who he is, what he wants, how long he'd been watching before I noticed him, why my house, why me, or whether that question is even the right one. Because here is the thing that has stayed with me, the thing I can't shake. The family that lived in the blue house saw him for weeks before they left. And when they left, he found them, which means he had either followed them or anticipated where they'd go, which means this isn't random, which means there is a logic to it that I don't understand. I've spoken to 3 different police officers. I've filed reports. I have camera footage. I have a photograph. I have a preserved footprint. I have a printout of a 3-year-old forum thread and a second-hand account of a Christmas card that said, "He found us." And I still don't have an answer to the question I keep coming back to. What does he do when he decides he's watched long enough? I'm still in the house on Carver Street. I know people will wonder about that. Why didn't I leave? And I've thought about it. I've thought about it a lot. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. The Harmons left. They packed up and started over somewhere new. And according to that one line on a Christmas card, it didn't matter. Whatever this is, it isn't about the house. And if it isn't about the house, then leaving might not be the answer. So I'm still there. I check the cameras before I go to sleep. I vary my schedule. I know my neighbors' cars and my neighbors' faces well enough now that anything unfamiliar stands out. I've talked to 3 of the families on the block, told them some version of what's been happening, asked them to let me know if they see anything. One of them, the older man who gardens on weekends, whose name I now know as Arthur, told me he'd seen the man before. Once, a couple of years ago, before I moved in, standing in front of the house in the exact same spot. I thought he was a real estate agent, Arthur said, someone casing the property. I didn't think anything of it. Did he look at you? I asked. Arthur thought about it. No, he said slowly. He was looking at your house. At the time, the couple who lived there before you, they had just listed it. I assumed he was interested in buying. He paused. You know, now that I think about it, they moved out pretty fast. I never asked why. The couple before me, and the Harmons before them, and whoever lived there before the Harmons. I've started trying to trace the ownership of that house. Not the blue house, my house. I want to know how many families have lived here, and whether any of them left in a hurry, and whether any of them ever mentioned a man who stood across the street and watched. I haven't found everything yet, but I've found enough to know that I'm not the beginning of this story. I don't know yet if I'm the end. 2 nights ago, the camera alert went off again. I grabbed my phone, opened the app, checked every angle, front, back, sides, nothing. Empty street, empty yard, empty driveway. Even the sidewalk in front of the blue house was bare. But when I checked the footage playback, there was a gap. 4 minutes between 1:52 and 1:56 in the morning, where the front camera had recorded only static. Not a malfunction. The timestamp was intact. The recording continued on either side. Just 4 minutes of white noise in the middle of an otherwise normal night. 4 minutes where I don't know what was in front of my house. I've called the camera company. They say it's never happened before with that model. They said sometimes there's interference. They said not to worry. I didn't tell them that when I looked at the static frame by frame, slowing it down as much as the software would allow, there was a shape in it, faint and broken up by the noise, but there. A person standing on the sidewalk, completely still, looking at my door. I'm going to find out who this is. I'm going to find out what he wants, what this has been leading to, why that house across the street has been empty for 2 years, and why it isn't listed for sale and who pays the utilities, and what happened to the Harmon family and the family before me and every family before them. I'm going to find all of it, but I wanted to get this down first, in case it's useful to someone. In case there's someone else on another street in another town who's looked up from their window and found him already looking back. If that's you, if you're reading this and something about it sounds familiar, don't wait for it to escalate. Don't do what I did, or what the Harmons did, or what everyone seems to have done, which is convince yourself there's a reasonable explanation and wait for the reasonable explanation to arrive. It won't. Something else will.